There's a very real possibility that we are living through the final era of truly great raw comic book finds, and I don't think enough collectors fully understand what that means yet. Because if you've been in this hobby long enough, you've probably noticed something changing over the last several years. Not just prices, not just grading culture, the actual availability of untouched collections. Yes, they are getting harder to find. Not slightly harder, significantly harder. And today on Slabbed Portfolios, I want to talk about why I think raw comic collections are becoming increasingly scarce, why massive grading waves have permanently changed this hobby, and why the days of stumbling across untouched Golden Age books in the wild may be disappearing faster than most collectors realize or care to admit. Now, when most people first get into comics, especially through YouTube or social media, they grow up hearing these legendary stories. Somebody finds an old box in a basement, a garage collection surfaces, a storage locker opens up and there's a major key hidden inside. You've all heard the stories, I know I have. Maybe a Golden Age Batman in there, maybe an early Amazing Spider Man, maybe something unbelievably historic sitting untouched for decades. The most recent example that comes to mind is the Superman 1 that was found in the attic that sold for a record breaking price on Heritage Auctions not long ago. Those stories absolutely do happen, but I think what newer collectors sometimes miss is that many of those stories come from a very different era of comic book collecting. You have to remember that back then the hobby was smaller, grading wasn't nearly as dominant. Information wasn't instant, and millions of people had comics sitting in closets without fully understanding what they even owned. That environment barely exists anymore. Today, almost everybody knows comics have value. Not everybody understands the market deeply, obviously, but most people at least know enough to check. Families Google books now. Estate sales get researched. Storage unit buyers look for keys. Antique dealers recognize character names. Even non-collectors understand that older comics might be worth something. And because of that awareness, fewer major books are staying hidden for decades. But beyond awareness, there's another major factor changing the hobby permanently, and that's grading. We all know of that. The rise of slab culture has dramatically reduced the amount of important raw material still floating around the market. Think about what has happened over the last 15 years. Millions upon millions of books have been submitted to grading companies. Keys, semi-keys, Bronze Age books, Silver Age books, modern variants, Golden Age books. Collectors have slabbed everything, and a good amount of that, we could argue, shouldn't have been slabbed at all. And every time a major book does get graded, that's one less raw copy circulating naturally through collections, shops, conventions, estate finds, that kind of thing. That matters more than people realize, because slabbed books behave differently than raw books psychologically. Once a comic gets graded, authenticated, labeled, all that, it tends to stop moving casually through the hobby ecosystem. It then becomes an asset. It gets tracked more carefully, stored differently, sold more strategically, protected more aggressively, and over time, that process slowly drains the raw market. I mean, it just is what it is, guys. Now, obviously, there are still raw books out there. We all know that. I'm not saying hidden collections no longer exist. They absolutely do. But the ratio of them has changed dramatically, especially when you're talking about major Golden Age books. Finding something today like an Action 1 in the wild today would be unbelievably difficult. Not impossible, because technically anything can still surface, but incredibly unlikely. And the reason is simple. Most surviving copies have already been discovered, graded and archived, or absorbed into serious collections a long time ago. The same thing applies to books like Batman 1, All-American 16, Detective Comics 27, Marvel Comics number 1. These books are not just collectibles anymore. They're historical artifacts. And because they are historical artifacts, the surviving population gets tighter every year. Now, what's interesting is that many collectors still emotionally operate as though we're living in the era of massive undiscovered finds. And honestly, I understand why. Those stories are exciting. They're part of comic book mythology at this point. The fantasy of finding a major key in a random box is part of what keeps people hunting. But realistically, the hobby has become far more efficient. The internet changed that. Grading changed that. Auction houses changed that. Social media changed that. Information travels instantly now. If somebody inherits old comics, one search online immediately tells them to look for first appearances, issue ones, Golden Age books, major characters, that kind of thing. 25 years ago, that knowledge barrier was much higher. And this has changed the composition of comic hunting entirely. Years ago, collectors were hunting for discovery. Now they're hunting for opportunity. That's a very different thing. Because in the past, you could theoretically discover something the market didn't fully know existed yet. Today, most books are already mapped into the hobby ecosystem somewhere, which means modern comic hunting is less about hidden treasures and more about pricing inefficiencies, overlooked books, condition advantages, or timing. And honestly, that's part of why raw Golden Age books feel almost mythical now when they actually appear organically. If somebody walked into a local comic shop tomorrow with a completely raw Golden Age Superman key, collectors would probably crowd around it instantly. Not just because of the value, but because the experience itself feels increasingly rare. There's something different emotionally about raw books, especially older books. They feel connected to history in a way slabs sometimes don't. You see the wear, the aging, the paper texture, the smell of the pages, the imperfections. It feels like you're holding an object that survived generations naturally instead of being processed into an investment vehicle. And I think that emotional feeling is one reason raw books still fascinate collectors so deeply, despite how dominant grading has become. But ironically, grading culture itself may be one of the reasons raw books are disappearing faster than ever. Because once collectors find important books now, the instinct is usually immediate submission. Grade it, authenticate it, protect it, maximize it, and financially, that often makes complete sense. But collectively, over time, it transforms the market. It reduces the amount of untouched material circulating publicly, and you can actually see this effect happening across multiple eras now. Even Silver Age collections are getting harder to find in truly untouched condition. Bronze Age collections are becoming more picked over. And certain categories of raw books that used to show up regularly at conventions or antique stores barely appear anymore outside of established dealer networks. Now, one thing I find especially fascinating is how newer collectors sometimes underestimate just how many books have already been absorbed into permanent collections. There are collectors out there who have owned the same Golden Age books for 30 or 40 years and have no intention of ever selling them. That removes inventory from circulation as well. And as older collections get locked into private ownership, institutional collections, museums, or high end investment portfolios, the available supply tightens even further. That's why major keys sometimes feel impossible to locate publicly at certain times, even when census numbers technically exist. Because census populations don't tell you how many books are actually moving. A book can exist on paper statistically while effectively disappearing from the active market. And honestly, I think this trend is going to continue. As comics become more accepted as legitimate collectibles and alternative assets, more books are going to get stored professionally. More books are going to get graded, archived, which means the raw discovery side of the hobby may continue shrinking over time. Now, does that mean the fun is gone? No, absolutely not. There will always be collections found. There will always be forgotten boxes. There will always be estate sales and attic discoveries and strange stories that keep the hobby exciting. But I do think collectors need to understand that the environment today is fundamentally different from what it was decades ago. The market is more informed. The books are more tracked. The grading culture is more dominant, and the truly untouched collections are becoming rare, especially at the top. Because realistically, the odds of somebody casually uncovering a raw Batman 1 or Superman 1 without the book eventually being identified years ago are dramatically lower now than they were in the past. Those books have been hunted aggressively for generations at this point, and honestly, that scarcity may eventually become part of why raw Golden Age books carry such a special emotional weight among collectors moving forward. It's not just because they're valuable, but because they represent a version of the hobby that slowly feels like it's disappearing. The end of true comic discovery. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed to Slabbed Portfolios, where we break down comic books, collectibles, and market psychology so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. I will see you guys in the next one.